Vladimir Putin is planning his own BYOB party, Bring Your Own Blitzkrieg. He has over 125,000 troops massed on the Ukrainian border. And as the Polish foreign minister repeated today, Europe is now facing a greater likelihood of war than at any time in the last 30 years. That would mean since Bosnia. And we're thrilled to have with us Bosnia Bob, as they called the commander of UN forces back then. Bosnia Bob was more formally known as Colonel Stewart, and then he became Bob Stewart MP. He's the Tory member for Beckenham, and we're delighted to have him with us. The thinking seems to be that the ongoing diplomacy now is explicitly intended by Moscow to provide a pretext for invading Ukraine, because he's asked for demands that are never going to be met. Is that your take on it?
It is. There's absolutely no reason for Putin to... His scenario is this, that NATO is surrounding Russia and wants to do in Russia. But NATO's a defensive alliance. What Putin doesn't like is the fact that nations that were previously in the Soviet ambit, now they've been given their freedom, want to join NATO. NATO doesn't say, join us. They ask, can we join NATO? And the fact of the matter is, this is anathema to actually Moscow. And Putin is really jarred off. And he's massed all these troops on the border of Ukraine. Now, whether he's going to release them, that's another matter. By the way, they're also in Belarus, and they're also in the Crimea. If the Russians were to invade Ukraine, it would cause a huge international crisis. And actually, we can't say it, for goodness sake, because in Russia, all the people there are fed this diatribe from Putin that NATO is an offensive alliance, wants to rule Russia. So somehow or other, we've got to get our message through to the Russian people that the people that are running them are not telling the truth, that actually NATO is a defensive alliance. All its members want to be a member of it. It is not offensive. It is a defensive alliance. And that actually there is no reason for Putin to invade Ukraine that wants to be independent, wants to run its own affairs.
But Tony Blinken, I take your point that NATO is, in the formal sense, a defensive alliance. But Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has been, I think the phrase saber rattling is overused. But the fact that he is actually threatening Russia with consequences. So this thing has come out of nowhere. It's 6 months since we've had an American and a NATO humiliation with the fall of Kabul. 12 hours before the Taliban took charge in Kabul, Antony Blinken, as the senior American diplomatist, was tweeting that he'd just had a very productive conversation with the Canadian foreign minister. He doesn't have a lot of credibility. NATO doesn't have a lot of credibility. After you've just taken 20 years to lose to goat herds with fertilizer, why would Putin be worried about Antony Blinken versus the Red Army?
Well, I think the Russians have got to be worried about actually the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians themselves are pretty competent about defending their own country. They feel this very strongly. We keep thinking we've got to be there. It's got to be, NATO nations there. But Ukraine has actually armed itself. It wants to be independent. It will fight to be independent. NATO nations, here's the problem, there is no Article 5 commitment to Ukraine. Putin knows that. So if he was to invade, you wouldn't automatically get NATO going into Ukraine. Not automatically, but there's a possibility that NATO nations might do it. It's not just Ukraine, it's Bosnia. Bosnia is being threatened by Russian actions too, through Serbia, because of Republika Srpska trying to go. And there's a timeline on that, in probably like 4 months before Republika Srpska has given notice that it's going to split from the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. That is an extremely dangerous thing to do. Ukraine is a real problem, and actually we've got a problem in the Far East insofar as China is increasingly belligerent with regard to Taiwan.
Yeah, but isn't the reason for all these situations, I go back to the credibility thing. How can you, if a superpower and an alliance and a defensive alliance has to have a deterrent capability? What deterrent capability does the United States or the UK or any of the other allies have at the moment? And I'd also make the point, you're right about the Ukrainians. They want to defend their country, but in a sense, they're in the same position as the Afghans are in, slightly differently. But the Afghans were left with a fantastic state of the Air Force and nobody who knew how to maintain it. So they couldn't use it, couldn't take off the ground and use air power against the Taliban. Right now, Washington is refusing to give Kiev the air power materials that they feel they need for exactly the same reasons.
Well, it's probably because Ukraine has not been and is not a part of NATO. But NATO, includes the Baltic states, Poland, and there will not be an invasion. I don't see an invasion of NATO territory. Ukraine has been, since I was the chief of policy at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in 1994, Ukraine has been something called a part of Partnership for Peace. And from Partnership for Peace, they had the wish to join NATO. But NATO nations have got to agree for them to join NATO as well. They are not a part of NATO. That does not mean we don't care about them, because the British in particular have actually armed with defensive weapons and trained Ukrainian armed forces. Now look, even the Germans have warned Russia that if they take action in Ukraine, the German foreign minister has said that this will have serious consequences. Well, the real serious consequences, if that was to happen, will be sanctions. I know people say sanctions might not work, but in Russia, the people that would suffer are actually the people of Russia, not the people running the country, who've got huge billions in the West in various banks and offshore accounts. They'll be okay, but it'll be the Russian people. Now, we've got to get the message to the Russian people somehow that if action was to be taken in Ukraine, military action was to be taken in Ukraine, the Western powers, mainly NATO, but not exclusively, might well actually set up sanctions which would hurt them. Unfortunately, they're not getting that message because the Russian media is totally dominated by the regime.
What do you say? Because it's a common response from people who worry about this situation, is that Putin obviously is disturbed by the NATO expansion eastward, whether these countries, as in the Baltic states, wish for it. The Baltic states joining NATO, from Putin's point of view, is the equivalent of Joe Biden waking up in the morning, switching on the TV and discovering that the entire British West Indies have suddenly joined the Warsaw Pact. And then Canada joins the Warsaw Pact. In other words, what Putin's, regardless of anything else, what is the purpose of moving the eastern frontier of NATO right up to the Russian border? Because as I'm sure you know, the reason that Afghanistan was never formally incorporated into the British Empire is because they were very disturbed. The British were very disturbed at the idea of having a land border with the Russian Empire. They didn't think that was going to be anything but trouble.
We had the great game, of course. Well, I have to say that when I was the chief of policy at SHAPE, I was extremely concerned about that and wrote papers about taking the Baltic states into NATO. This was before they were, saying the problem is that we've got Kaliningrad. People won't perhaps understand that Kaliningrad is Russian, and it's to the east of the Baltic states. It's an enclave which is actually stuck full of military hardware, Russian military hardware. And I was really concerned about that and said that, but that was a political decision that if they wanted to join NATO and they qualified, because you have to prove that you're democratic and there are various other qualifications, if they wanted to join NATO, they could. I was a military at the time and wasn't political. I was a colonel, and my papers would say it doesn't make military sense because actually the Russians have got us outflanked. But I was told to shut up. That was not my decision. It was a political decision. And if free countries, want to join NATO, they were allowed to do so. My worry then, as it is now, is that actually those free countries may well actually be invaded and we wouldn't be able to do much about it in the time we had. They're not going to be invaded now. I'm really concerned about eastern Ukraine at the moment. We can kiss goodbye. We can kiss goodbye to Crimea. There's no way the Crimea will be going back to Ukraine, because as long as you've got the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, there's no way the Russians are going to give that back. And the majority of people in the Ukraine now not only speak Russian, but largely want to be with Russia.
That's a very interesting point you made. Let me just ask you this finally. Given the domestic politics in your party right now, do you think whoever is the Prime Minister of the UK makes much difference to this situation?
Yes, it damn well does. I mean, the last thing we want now, we've got a problem in the United Kingdom. We haven't conquered COVID. There are various other economic problems and social that we've got to actually deal with. But internationally, we've got this problem in the Balkans, in Bosnia, this problem in the Ukraine, and we've got the problem in Taiwan. The European Union is hamstrung. They fundamentally, one good reason for being out of the European Union is that if we were stuck in the European Union, there'd be no decision, because various European countries in the European Union have different views on what's happening in the Balkans and probably what's happening in Ukraine. So they don't have a joint policy. The Americans, on the other hand, are getting increasingly isolationist. The only country that has actually got any kind of clout and any kind of ability to do something internationally is the United Kingdom. The last damn thing we want now in our country, and I'm thinking beyond Westminster, beyond the Conservative Party, I'm thinking of my country. We need to have a Prime Minister that's in post, and we don't, right now, want to squabble in the Conservative Party as who might be Prime Minister for the next, 4, 5, 6 weeks. At this crucial time, no, better to keep what we've got, because actually we've got a Prime Minister in post and we've got ministers that actually know their brief. We have got a crisis international now. We've got problems at home. Don't change the Prime Minister right now, because no Prime Minister of this country has been dismissed because of a bloody party.
OK, there you are. Bob Stewart weighing up the consequences of bring your own bottle parties at number 10 versus the great geopolitical moves afoot in Eastern Europe and elsewhere.